Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. On Saturday, the 77-year-old Joseph Robinette Biden, or Joe Biden, was elected the 46th President of the United States, and Senator Kamala Harris the Vice President. This presidential race had, of course, been contested between Biden, the nominee for the Democratic Party, and the incumbent President Donald Trump for the Republican Party. And the election ended after a nail-biting 4 days. In this episode, we talk about what led to Biden's win, the factors that influenced this election, and what its results mean for India. For this, we first talked to Karishma Mehrotra, who has been covering the US elections for the Indian Express. She had joined us on a call from New York. Karishma begins by talking about the issues that were on the minds of the voters going into this election and how the two candidates had dealt with them.
I think both of the campaigns tried to stir the issues in a way that would help them. So, for example, I think Biden was very focused on the pandemic, and he continued to sort of redirect answers and narrative towards Trump's handling of COVID-19.
Trump, who himself tested positive for COVID-19, has been accused of downplaying the threat posed by the virus. He has also been severely criticized for refusing to follow critical public health guidelines, including wearing a mask and holding large rallies during his campaign. And this was happening despite the US having the most number of cases and deaths due to the virus. This is one of the things that Biden had stressed upon during his campaign.
And I think contrasting to that, you saw that Trump was very focused on ideas of law and order, ideas of safety and danger in the cities, sort of riding on the back of some of the massive protests that we saw this summer.
The protests Karishma talks about here are the Black Lives Matter protests that were triggered by the killing of a 46-year-old black man named George Floyd by a white police officer. The incident led to thousands to protest across the country, demanding police reform and an end to racial violence. The movement had also sparked protests in other parts of the world. It became one of the largest movements in the US history, and it happened during the pandemic.
So I think voters were thinking about those things, but voters were also thinking about probably all the things that have been important issues in American history: the economy, abortion, guns, the Supreme Court, I think jobs, criminal justice reform, police brutality. I think that there were many different issues. But I think if we look at the campaign perspective, it was very clear what the two campaigns were focused on. It was very COVID versus law and order narratives.
Karishma says that people had been really anxious during the time leading up to the elections.
There were lots of conversations that usually, if not people worried about some forms of violence, they were discussing other people who were worried about some forms of violence. And it wasn't to say that everybody thought that there was going to be violence, but for some reason, we were all sort of discussing, oh, this could happen, this could happen. I think there was also a lot of anxiety around the fact that Trump would not explicitly state that, he would agree to a peaceful transfer of power. I think that was on people's mind, like what would that look like if Trump did lose, but he wasn't willing to leave his seat. There was a lot of anxiety in the air.
Trump had specifically been asked about this, whether he will commit to a peaceful transition or not, and he had refused to answer.
Will you commit to making sure that there is a peaceful transferal of power after the election?
Well, we're going to have to see what happens. You know that I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster.
I understand that, but people are rioting. Do you commit to making sure that there's a peaceful transferal of power?
We want to get rid of the ballots, and we'll have a very peaceful. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation.
During the days prior to the election, Karishma was also hearing from people that apparently there were those who were buying guns for the first time, or at least thinking about buying a gun for the first time. And when she looked into it, there were actually numbers to support that.
And so I did one story a few days before the election looking at the rise in first-time gun owners. And I think it was interesting to see a lot of that was also happening on the left, like within Democrats. So there was a lot of anxiety in the air, I think, and it was tense. It was also very suspenseful. Also, the media was very persistently cautioning voters to be patient, that there was not going to be a result the night of, given the extensive or the large amount of mail-in ballots that came in.
Due to the coronavirus, a lot of people chose to vote by mail instead of doing it in person.
Interestingly, the violence thing did not seem to be true. There was very, very scattered tensions and protests, but there was no widespread issues after elections. But on the other hand, the delayed results was definitely something that we saw. The whole world was watching for 3 days to see who Americans had elected. And so I think those two things it led to quite a bit of anxiety.
During the 4 days that the election lasted, things remained tense, she says.
So the night of the election, it seemed like it was, Trump had gotten Florida. It seemed clear that he had also gotten Texas. And there wasn't too much showing up for Biden at that point. As the days continued, you start to see in the states where Trump had earlier had a lead, that lead became narrower and narrower. And then soon you inevitably saw Biden surpass Trump in some very key states, such as Pennsylvania.
Karishma says that the margins remained close. But by Thursday, analysts were saying that Trump doesn't seem to have the numbers he would need to win.
It started, I think, for many folks that, Wednesday and Thursday, it became quite clear that Biden was going to surpass Trump. And he also seemed more and more to have more avenues to surpass Trump. He had like an approaching lead and then a lead in several different states, whereas Trump had much fewer options to try and get the required electoral votes. The other interesting thing that happened, I think, in that time was you had actually Fox News, which is a right-leaning platform, news network, call Arizona for Biden quite early on Wednesday. The Trump campaign really disputed that. And I think that sort of marked a new transition point in the counting process where, starting with that on Wednesday, you started to see it become more difficult for Trump to find avenues to make that work.
As this happened, on Thursday evening, Trump also held a press conference. And during it, he delivered a speech that was so full of falsehoods and disinformation that 3 major US television networks, CBS, NBC, and ABC, cut away from it and issued statements rejecting his claims.
If you count the legal votes, I easily win. If you count the illegal votes, they can try to steal the election from us. If you count the votes that came in late, we're looking at them very strongly, but a lot of votes came in late. I've already decisively won many critical states, including massive victories in Florida, Iowa, Indiana, Ohio.
Okay, here we are again in the unusual position of not only interrupting the President of the United States, but correcting the President of the United States. And Ari Melber, don't go.
There had been no proof of any illegal votes, and Donald Trump clearly hadn't won. The election results actually became clear on Saturday morning. Majority of the votes had been counted by then, and it became obvious that no matter how many votes are counted now, Donald Trump would not be able to win. That is when the Associated Press called the election for Joe Biden. Karishma had been in New York then.
I was in an apartment and I was busy with something else. And I heard the news by just hearing shouts outside, just, massive sort of screams and honking. And so then I looked at my phone, turned on Twitter, and sure enough, 2 minutes before it had been called. So those screams and shouting continued all throughout the day. There were major sort of parties on the street and loud music and dancing. Tons of people, even right now, as I'm recording this with you, it's getting into Sunday morning, and there are tons of folks in nearby parks. So there was a lot of elation in a place like New York. I can't speak to what the response was in other places in this country, and I'm curious to know what that might have looked like. I think from my vantage point, what I saw today was a lot of honking and a lot of screaming. There's a song with a sort of vulgar slur against Donald Trump that's been playing nonstop across the city.
This was New York, though. Karishma says that because the country is so divided, the reactions would have been much different in other parts. She says that a lot of what led to the win was a result of Trump's handling of the pandemic and his reaction to the Black Lives Matter protests. Trump had not supported the protests and at one point even alluded to them as a symbol of hate. During the presidential debates, he had also refused to denounce white supremacist groups that believe that white people are superior to those of other races and have engaged in acts of violence and terror in the country. Trump, during his presidency, has also been accused of making statements that are Islamophobic and sexist, and has also been accused by multiple women of sexual assault. Now, for voters, in sharp contrast, you had Joe Biden, a veteran politician who had served as the vice president under Barack Obama for 8 years. Someone whose message was calming, who appealed to unite both the sides.
And I think after a lot of divisions in this country, I think some voters did find that calmness and that sort of normalcy to be something worth voting for. But of course, like I said, it's a two-party system. So for many groups in this country, it wasn't necessarily a Biden vote. It was very much a non-Trump vote. And so I think you had people who were very enthusiastic about Biden, but you also had people who were very, very fearful of another 4 years of a Trump presidency. So I think those are the things. He also had a lot of name recognition. I think that's one thing that helped him in the primaries, especially amongst Black voters. And that's something that has been noted about him, that he has built pretty strong relationships with communities across the country and in Washington. And so his name recognition, his ability to draw on those relationships, I think probably helped him as well.
Karishma says that what also made a difference was states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin that had traditionally voted Democratic. But when Trump ran for president 4 years back, they had voted Republican. Biden this time managed to swing them again to vote for the Democratic Party.
There's other states as well. I think Arizona and Georgia were never considered real possibilities for a Democratic campaign, and especially Georgia. If you look at the map, Georgia is just surrounded by red. It's in the South. It has been talked about for quite, I would say, 4 years or so about, it seems like it's turning blue. It seems like it's turning blue.
Turning blue means it's turning Democratic.
People talk about Texas in a similar way. It seems like Texas did not go that way this time, but Georgia has shown in many ways that it's a state in the South that really could turn Democrat. So I think these were the states that people really had their eyes on this time around. Florida was a state that people thought maybe could go to Biden, but it ended up not going. And again, it's a very, very close race in Florida. But that turned red again. So I think the states that were really interesting to watch were Pennsylvania and Georgia this time, and Arizona.
Apart from the presidential race, votes were also cast for the House of Representatives and the Senate, which are the lower and upper houses, kind of like the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, but with different roles. Karishma points out that this time, despite Democrats winning the presidential race, they have actually lost seats in the lower house, even though they still have a majority there. In the upper house, as of this recording, the votes remain tied. And she says that if the Senate goes to the Republicans, Biden is going to have a hard time trying to effectively govern. This is something that the Democrats hadn't expected. But still, Biden is a big win for the Democrats. And this election has been historic in more ways than one. Karishma tells us the reason, starting from the Vice President Kamala Harris.
Kamala Harris is the first woman and the first person of color and the first person of South Asian descent and first person of African American descent, all of those to be the vice president, to be in the White House. Joe Biden is the oldest president that we've had. Trump in 25 years is the first president to be ousted after a one term. So, these are the things. It's the first election within a pandemic, with all of these mail-in ballots. It was a very different method of voting in this country this time.
She says that the other thing that was different this time was how many voters felt that this election came as kind of like an existential crisis. And the campaigns focused on this too. There was a lot of talk about saving the soul of America. And you heard that in Joe Biden's speech after he got elected.
I pledge to be a president who seeks not to divide, but unify. Who doesn't see red states and blue states, only sees the United States. I sought this office to restore the soul of America, to rebuild the backbone of this nation, the middle class, and to make America respected around the world again.
And this is something Kamala Harris spoke about too.
And when our very democracy was on the ballot in this election, with the very soul of America at stake, and the world watching, you ushered in a new day for America.
The other historic factor was that Biden received the most votes that any presidential candidate has ever got in the US. And Trump became the second highest vote getter ever.
So it was actually a record turnout in many ways. Over 67% of the population ended up voting. America does usually not have a huge turnout for elections. So 67% is a very high number for this country.
This, Karishma says, had also reflected in her conversations with people while she was traveling across the country.
I met a lot of voters who this was the first time they cared about politics in a long time. For 4 years, before 4 years ago, they did not think about politics. And so that sort of way in which this choice is weighed on people's minds for a long time, there was something that felt quite historic about this choice this time.
Meanwhile, Trump and his campaign have been claiming election fraud, despite any evidence, and have been threatening to file lawsuits.
It doesn't seem, from the face of it, that any of these lawsuits will cause any change in the results. That does not seem to be a likelihood at this point. But, it's worth it to say that Trump's campaign has very clearly said that they will try to change the outcome. Whereas if we look at the map now, Trump would have to fight a battle on multiple state fronts at this point. So it's, as the count continues, it looks less and less like the Trump campaign will be able to shift what we're seeing. But yes, they've been very clear that their fight is not over at this point.
Trump has also appealed for a recount in some states. But experts say that at this point, it is not going to make much of a difference. There are also talks that Trump might not concede or refuse to leave his position. But Karishma says that you don't need Trump to concede for Biden to become the president.
Trump does have every power that he had before today until the inauguration in January. So Trump can do whatever is within a president's power within that time. However, it is not in his hands about whether or not he's president or not.
She says that Trump might try to file a lawsuit in this case as well, but chances are very slim that anything will happen in this regard. When it comes to the position of the president, though, Karishma says that Joe Biden has a lot of challenges ahead for him.
He doesn't have control of the House. He might not get control of the Senate. Those are probably going to be a huge roadblock for him. Biden could potentially face a really difficult road ahead in trying to create any sort of compromise with the congressional chambers.
The other challenge that he will face is from within his own party, which has moved much more towards the left, and many of its members are a lot more progressive than Biden. Many during his campaign had even criticized him for it. Biden, compared to them, is much more of a centrist. This is why, like mentioned earlier, a lot of people from his party have voted more against Trump than voted for him.
So I think that he's going to have to sort of negotiate with that sect of the party as well. And Trump made it a huge point to associate Harris and Biden with what he called, in quotes, the radical left. So I think Biden has a lot of work to do in terms of compromise. He has said that his first task is to set up this coronavirus task force. And, he, of course, with all of these campaigns, you have a transition team that has already been working for months on if Biden were to win, what would be his immediate plans in place. So he's got people there standing ready to put those plans in place. And like I said, it looks like a response to COVID would probably be his first place to look.
The other challenge will, of course, be to bring a divided nation together.
He's led this campaign of healing and normalcy and calmness in a very hotly divided country, a very fractured country, and a country that, doesn't seem to have any room to drift away from that. So it'll be a challenge for Biden to prove that he can attend to all of these aspects of his party's base.
Dear listeners, before we move on to the rest of the show, I just wanted your quick attention. One of the big reasons people say they like this show is because it helps them understand the news better. It provides them with the context they need to see the bigger picture. And there is perhaps no other place that does that better than Indian Express's Explained section. We on Three Things refer to the section regularly, and it helps us make this show. If you're a regular reader of Indian Express, you know how useful the Explained section can be, especially when you're looking for in-depth analysis by the right experts. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explained and access the coverage 24/7. Explained by Indian Express, where news that matters is explained by experts who know the subject. Now, back to the show. As Joe Biden gets ready to become the next president of the United States, the question that is on the minds of a lot of people here is, what does his win mean for India? And whether his tenure will be good for this country or not. To answer this question, we speak to Indian Express's associate editor Shubhajit Roy, who reports on matters of foreign affairs for the paper. And he first points out that during his years of being a vice president, he had advocated for a stronger relationship with India.
But, even before he became the vice president, as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which is essentially something equivalent to, in Indian context, if I would like to give an example, it will be something like Rajya Sabha's Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, his chair. So he was somewhat equivalent to that in the American political system. And even in that position, he had systematically worked towards deepening of strategic engagement with India. In fact, in 2006, 3 years before he became the vice president, he announced his vision for the future of US-India relations. And in fact, and I quote him, he said at that point of time, "My dream is that in 2020, the two closest nations in the world will be India and the United States." So in that sense, it is a very prescient kind of a vision. In 2020, India indeed is extremely close to the United States, especially in the wake of a rise of China.
Shubhajit also points out that between 2005 and 2008, when the nuclear deal was being negotiated between India and US, Obama had initially been hesitant. But it had been Biden who had worked with both Democrats and the Republicans to get the deal approved. Now, as he moves to head the US administration, though, there are a number of issues that India is concerned about.
So if you take the number one sort of issue right now, which brings India and US closer, is the issue of rise of China and an aggressive China. Now, the Trump administration had been very, very vocal and articulate about this rise of aggressive China. And it had been also very vocal about support to India in the last 6 months during the border standoff with China. In Washington, there is a sort of a bipartisan consensus amongst the Democrats and the Republicans on China as a strategic rival and a threat. Now, there is an expectation in India that even when Biden comes to power, that kind of vision would continue when it comes to China. Now, there could be some nuancing and some calibration in the language from the rhetoric from US officials, but substantively, it should remain the same track.
Similarly, when it comes to the issue of terrorism, he points out that Biden's campaign document has said that there can be no tolerance for terrorism in South Asia, cross-border or otherwise.
Cross-border terrorism, as you know, is sort of the code word for Pakistan-sponsored terrorism directed towards India. And India has sort of raised this issue with successive US administrations. And that, I think, would be, again, an issue on which the US administration's approach will be carried forward.
The third issue which concerns a lot of Indians is that of immigration and H-1B visas, an area where the Trump administration had put restrictions. Here, Shubhajit says that people expect Biden to be softer and more open towards Indians who want to work or study in the US.
So, in that sense, as the Trump administration had tightened the rules, Biden administration would be expected to reverse some of those approaches adopted in the last 4 years, but it may not be very easy for him to reverse that. The last point I would talk about is the human rights issues, which is the tricky subject when it comes to the current Indian government, which, due to its policies towards, say, Kashmir or passage of the Citizenship Amendment Act and the proposed nationwide NRC, all of this has generated a strong critical reaction from the US Congress. Now, the Trump administration had been very supportive of India. It did not go beyond making some perfunctory statements. But with Democrats in power, the Indian government can expect some tough statements from the Biden administration on these issues. And with Kamala Harris as the vice president, she's known to be extremely vocal about human rights issues. This could be a new sticking point for the Indians and the Americans.
But considering everything, Shubhajit says that like previous administrations, Biden is likely to continue to work to strengthen the ties between the two nations.
You know, if you put all the last 4 presidents from the US over the last 2 decades, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, if you put them in a room, they would possibly disagree and differ on every single issue, except there is one issue on which they would all have a common agreement, consensus, is that a stronger relationship with India. And keeping this in mind, my sense is that that tradition of bipartisan support will be continued by Joe Biden, who is right now the president-elect. Of course, he will have his own style, nuances, put his own personal stamp on the relationship, but he would continue the tradition of a stronger India-US ties.
You were listening to 3 Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and as always was edited and mixed by our producer, Joshua Thomas. Before we go, here's another reminder to check out Indian Express's Explain section. You can log on to indianexpress.com/explain and find in-depth analysis by the right experts. It has everything you need to know to understand the news better and see the bigger picture. If you like this show, then you can subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.